Some of you have, we talk about some of the movies and things that we watch kind of during the break. We were talking about it. Have you ever, and I think having, based just on the conversations we just had, some of us, I think I know the answer to the question, but have you ever watched a show or read a book, for those of you who do that kind of thing, or worse yet, occasionally you'll see it in real life, where the villain wins? You see those kind of movies, you read those kind of books, and sometimes you see it in real life, where the villain just wins. It seems like right just cannot triumph, and sometimes, you know, we bemoan the fact in order to be right, you have to play by the rules, and evil doesn't have to play by the rules, and so they have an advantage, and evil ends up winning the day. And I don't know about you, but I get really frustrated when I read and when I hear and when I watch those kind of stories. I like the villain to get their comeuppance, and I like for the good guys to win. And you know, the why behind it's simple because as a friend of mine recently revealed to me, he said, "You just were never very good at being bad." And you know, there were for many years, you know, I wanted to be the bad boy. I just don't seem to have it in me, which is not to say that I don't do anything wrong, because that's a very long list. But, you know, being that you know, the bad boy, I just am not very good at it. And so I always want the good guy to win, because there's just something that I identify very strongly, you know, with characters who are the good guy. And up into this point, the book of Esther has felt a lot like that kind of a story. And if you haven't been reading ahead, and this is all kind of new for you, it may feel like that. I know every week when I have to stop the story, and we keep stopping the story in the middle of the stream, as it were, and we're never getting to the rest of the story. We're never getting to the end of the story. We're never getting to resolution. But the way the story's been going, it just feels like the bad guys are winning. You know, it feels like Haman has ascended to authority, and that he is going to have his way ultimately with the Jews. They are set for destruction. It's been, you know, inked in the law of the Medes and the Persians that does not change. Their destruction is assured. Haman seems to be the guy who is going to be the guy. He's the villain of the story, and I hate him. And I can say that in Christian love. I hate him as a character. I hate him as a person, and I hate the fact that it looks like he's going to win. And so far, we've seen that kind of dynamic going on in the book of Esther. What I can tell you this morning as we get to Esther chapter 6 is Esther is not that story. And today, we finally get to see a little bit of resolution. Today, we finally get to see a little bit of Haman getting his comeuppance. And I've been waiting for this day more than any other. Each week it's just been I've been wanting to get here faster, more, because I hate Haman more every time I read the story, and every time I talk about him, I dislike him, and I want him to get what's his. And today, he does. Now, you ever had a bad day? I know that's a rhetorical question. Those of you who are kids, like, what's a bad day? We were out with Luke yesterday. He's like, my life is terrible. I'm like, you're 5. You don't even know what a terrible life is. You know, I wish my life was as terrible as yours. You know, that kind of deal. But sometimes you have days that are just bad. They start off bad. You wake up late. You know, you ever feel like as an adult you shouldn't have to use the excuse that my alarm didn't ring, and yet it happens, and you feel like almost childish. You know, because you're late, because your alarm didn't ring. You're like, I'm like, you know, fill in the blank years old. I should know how to program my alarm by now, and yet it just didn't work. You know, the power goes out. You forgot to turn it on. Whatever. There's 1,000 reasons how it happens. None of which are valid. None of which are great, but they happen. And so you start off the day late. You get running, and things are bad, and it just seems like the whole day kind of goes downhill from there. Haman is going to have a bad day that we could almost call it apocalyptic in its badness. I mean, this is the bad day of all bad days. You almost feel bad for Haman by the end of his day. Almost, not quite, but almost. So as we get into chapter 6, now sometimes we have gone through some of these chapters. We have gone through large time chunks. And we'll see that occasionally where you have a lot of time transpires between verses, a lot of time transpires between chapters. We don't have that here at all. The story slows way down, and we get all kinds of detail as we go. And so we're right basically where we left off last week. Now, last week we left off with Haman. He had called together his wife, and he'd called together his closest friends and advisors, and he had bragged to them about how great he was. He talked about how much wealth he had. He talked about how much power he had. He talked about how much influence he had. And he talked about how great a person he was and how miserable he was because Mordecai refused to bow to him. And he kind of left it as saying, I have the awesomest life you could possibly imagine, except for this one thing that's ruining it all. And that's really where he was. He was so bent out of shape at Mordecai that it was ruining his entire existence that one guy just refused to bow. And so his wife had come up with this great idea. Let's build a 75-foot gallows. You convince the king to hang Mordecai on that gallows, and then you'll be happy, and your life will be perfect. And that banquet that Queen Esther has invited you to, you and the king, you can go to that, and you can just be at peace and happy knowing that Mordecai is gone. And so this is the grand scheme that Haman has gone to bed with, gallows being built and things going on. And he's up early the next day because he wants to get to the king's house. But the king hasn't had quite that good a night's sleep. And so we pick up in chapter 6 with Mordecai's reward. Now, this is kind of the odder side of the story maybe to think about or to start with. But what we see is Mordecai actually has a reward coming because he's done something well, but he hasn't been rewarded for. You ever done that? You ever been there? You did something good, and you didn't even get a thank you. It was just like assumed that you were going to be a rock star. You just assume that you're going to be great and awesome, and you're going to give everything you have, and it's just kind of overlooked. And Mordecai was kind of living in that reality. And so he actually gets his reward in Esther chapter 6, beginning of verse 1. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So there's just a little bit of narcissism you have to see here, because the king's like, I can't sleep. Bring me the book and read to me about me. That's kind of what he just did. He's like, bring the record of my life. He had a chronicler that walked around with him all the time. He had like his own press agent, and the guy just walked around and recording all the stuff that happened, to and around the king. And the king's like, I can't sleep. Why don't you read to me about me? Let's rehearse this is like almost like reading your own diary, except that when you're king, somebody else writes it for you and then reads it back. So it takes introspection to a very narcissistic new place. But that's where he is. In verse 2, and it was written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And if you remember the story, we hit it a few weeks ago, that here was Mordecai in the king's gate, and he heard about these two guys who didn't like the king, and so they were going to try to kill the king, and he let it be known. He told Esther, who told the king, who then did some investigation, found out these two guys were plotting for his life. They were killed, and that was the good deed that Mordecai had done, but nothing ever happened because of it. He never received any kind of reward, no gratuity, no thank you letter, no nothing. It was just assumed, kind of, that things were good. And so the king hears about this, and so you get in, you keep going. Let's see, where we go. I'm in the wrong chapter, no wonder. It was written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him saying, nothing has been done for him. So there's just this acknowledgement. The king just kind of, overlooked it. And he's like, I guess when you're the king, you assume somebody else is going to take care of stuff. And so that may have been his thing, just assuming that somebody had done it. He didn't. So he's like, oh, so whatever happened to that guy? What did we do? And they're like, we didn't really do anything. So the king said, who is in the court? Now, here's where it starts to get interesting because, he's been, reading or having bedtime stories of his life read to him throughout the night. And so he's like, all right, well, who's in the court? Who's around? We've gone from middle of night to early morning. He's like, who's around that can do something? And so Haman had just entered into the king's outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And if this were a movie, this is where you'd get the soundtrack going, dun, dun, dun. Because, here comes Haman. He's early to work. I mean, he's wicked early because he wants to suggest to the king that they hang Mordecai on the gallows. Meanwhile, the king is looking for somebody who is going to reward Mordecai. You sense that Haman might be about to have a bad day? Do you see this one coming? He didn't see it coming from 1,000 miles away. So the king's servants said to him, Haman is there standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, now here's where it gets fun, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman, I want to honor somebody. What should be done to the person that the king wants to honor? Now, what is Haman thinking? Well, I mean, he can't see past himself. He's like, who would the king possibly want to honor but like the second guy of the kingdom? Certainly, I have done well for the king, and certainly I would be the one that the king would want to honor. Certainly, I'm the one that I want to honor. And so this is Haman's thought process. You kind of appreciate it. Now, Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, like the third guy in command, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So get a noble, bring him in here, have him dress the guy in royal robes, have him set the guy on a royal horse, and have him lead that horse through the city, being the town crier. Now this is the part of it that's probably the least noble, but he's like, let him be the servant, let the noble be the servant, let him serve this guy, and then let him run like an idiot out in front of the horse going, hey everybody, look, this is what happens to the guy the king wants to declare. Now this is something usually done for footmen who are declaring the king's coming. And he's like, let it be one of the princes, one of the greatest men of the realm, let him do this menial task for the man that the king wants to honor me. Oh, then let this, let's see, where are we? Verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested. And you can see the wheels starting to come on off the train here. Take the robe. No, somebody else needs to take the robe. Take the horse and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. Haman, that's a fantastic idea. Here's my robe. There's my horse. Get the robe, get the horse, take it down to Mordecai, put it on Mordecai, and parade him around the capital, telling how great he is and how fond I am of him. And don't slack at all. Don't leave anything undone. Don't hold back any passion in this moment. Imagine being Mordecai. This is where you almost feel sorry for him. Almost, but not quite. I mean, he's not just evil. He is evil. If you get the drift, right? He is evil. I mean, he's bad. And so this feels good, doesn't it? He's finally getting some of his comeuppance. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, probably still wearing the king's robe. That's pretty cool. Well, unless the king had BO problems. But anyway. But Haman hurried to his house mourning with his head covered. I'm having a bad day. He's in mourning. I mean, this is terrible. He was going to the palace because he wanted to kill Mordecai, and instead he had to walk Mordecai around the palace telling everybody how great Mordecai was. I So Haman was having a bad day. And we chuckle because, I mean, he was so stuck on himself that now he's literally gone into mourning. He's covering his head, and you can see him just kind of shuffling his way back home, because I get a feeling that this is a guy who wore his emotions on his sleeves and was just, when he was mopey, like everybody knew he was mopey. You could feel the mope coming before you saw him. And so he's shuffling home, morbid and in mourning and moping over what's just happened, because his day, I mean, the highlight of his day is going to be this luncheon with the king and the queen. And he thought he was going to have dessert ahead of time and hang Mordecai and be done with that whole thing. And he could just enjoy life. And instead, life is giving him lemons. And he doesn't know the recipe for lemonade. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. They're like, dude, this is bad. The fact that Mordecai got his reward is, that's good for him, but this is bad for you, because if the king begins to favor Mordecai more than you, and that seems to be what's happening here. He just had you parade him around town. You've begun to fall in the king's estimation, and Mordecai's begin to raise in the king's estimation. And if Mordecai is of Jewish descent, you're toast. This plan that you have is not going to work out the way you hoped. And so you get the first of Haman's impending doom as things are bad and getting worse. So you get Mordecai's reward. Now, reward is important because we saw in Mordecai, here was a guy who was faithful, here was a guy who did what was right and got nothing. But eventually, the reward kind of caught up with him, and so it's an important thing, and we'll come back to that. And then in chapter 7, Haman's bad day continues, actually intensifies a little bit. And we see here that Haman gets a repayment for all of his bad deeds. And so all of those things, all of those reasons that we hate Haman, all of those things that he has done, especially to the Jewish people, that make us despise him so much, he is going to be repaid for all of that and then some. And so we get it in chapter 7. We'll keep reading. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. So, he's home. He has this little powwow with his wife and his counselors, but he's got a lunch appointment. You can't just skip out when you're having lunch with the king and queen. You can't rain check that. You can't call in sick. You can't call in depressed. And you can't even be depressed, worst of all. You've got to kind of push that all deep down so that you can go and be happy and be thrilled to be in the king's presence and dining with the queen. Now, this is still a big deal, and you've got to go and you've got to, appreciate the fact that it's a big deal. And so gets it all together, gets to the palace, gets ready for this thing. On the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." And so again, the king just says, Esther, I really want to know what's on your mind. What is it that's bothering you? Obviously, you didn't risk your life to ask me to lunch. You didn't make me lunch so that you could make me lunch again. There's something that's weighing your heart. There's something that's weighing on your mind. You have something in mind that you want to ask of or from me. Please ask it from me. I have tremendous fondness for you. I'll give you anything you want. What do you want? Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given at my petition and my people at my request." My request, dear, is that I want to live. I want to live, and I want my people to live. Now, who knows so far that Esther's Jewish? You do. I do. Mordecai does. Haman doesn't. He knows that, Haman knows that Mordecai is Jewish, but he doesn't know that there's a family relationship there. He has no idea that Esther is Jewish. How about the king? Does he know she's Jewish? No, he didn't care. He just knew she was pretty and that she was easy to get along with. And she told good stories. He has no idea. Plot's kind of thickening here. For we have been sold, she goes on, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And you could see the gears in Haman's head just kind of slamming up against the inside of his skull, because this sounds like something I'm familiar with that I've done, and this can't be a good line of conversation. Had we been sold as male and female servants, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Where is the guy who thinks he can take the queen's life? Where is the guy who thinks he can take the queen's family and just slaughter them and kill them? Where is this guy? And you can see Xerxes starting to get, a little bit indignant here, a little bit angry here. You can see all the soldiers who are around suddenly snap to, and they're ready to go. They're like, all right, that sounds like a fight going. Let's get it on. And so the tension in the room just ratcheting up, just spiraling up. And the king, you can see him getting red-faced and getting upset and getting angry. And you can see the color absolutely draining out of Haman's face. That he looked like Casper. I think he was just pale as a ghost because he could see what was coming. He knew who it was. And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. I think she's pointing her manicured fingers at him. So Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. I think that's a great understatement because he's the only guy in the room who's voting for him. He's the only person in this room that suddenly the king is livid. Suddenly Esther is railing. I mean, she's gone from this nice, meek, mild host to there's the guy. And every soldier in the room is just like, dude, you're toast. And the spear points going everywhere. Yeah, I bet he was terrified. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. So he just storms out. He's like, counting to 10. 1, 2. And you can see him like storming away. And you can see the contingent of the guards going, stay, go, trying to figure out what to do. And Haman's just sitting there going, ah. And the king's off trying to like cool down a little bit because he doesn't want to blow a vein. The king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden, but Haman stood before Queen Esther pleading for his life. Interesting turn of events. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Oh, this is just not good. You think about it, here they're reclining on these couches, they're eating, and things are bad. The king has just stormed off. He's angry. The soldiers are trying to figure out what they want to do. Esther's been yelling at him, and he is pleading. He's stood up now. He's gotten off his couch. He's gone over, and he's begging, and he trips, just like I'm trying not to do on this stage all morning long. You can almost see him just tripping. Please, please, and he just falls, and he hits the couch that Esther is reclining on, still at this meal. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? Counting to 10 didn't work because he hit 11, and he comes back in, and here's Haman now on the couch, sprawled out all over the queen, and the king just loses it. As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. That classic, put a bag over their head? The soldiers suddenly knew what was going on. They're like, yeah, you're done. So they bagged his head. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high. We can see it from here, from the palace. There's this huge stake in the ground. I think we can do something with this." Which Haman made for Mordecai. Your friend, the guy who's looking out for you, Mordecai, not the guy who's assaulting your wife, Mordecai, the guy who's looking out for you, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So this great big gallows they had built for Mordecai. Verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. I love chapter 7 of Esther so much, because here you get a guy who deserves to die, and painfully, and with great irony, and you have all of it. It's just very fulfilling to me. Haman's end was exactly what I wanted it to be. Found great pleasure and relief in that. Because for a while, it seemed like Mordecai was going to die with the rest of the Jews. And for a while, it seemed like Haman was going to be the guy who lived happily ever after. But that would have been, I think, truly random ending to the story. And God, the God we serve, the God who holds the whole world in his hands, who has heaven awaiting for us, is a lot of things, but random is not one of them. And the book of Esther, despite the fact that it begins with so many random threads that don't seem to go anywhere, they all kind of coalesce into this very tidy picture at the end. And we find that none of those events in the book of Esther are random. In fact, we're going to continue to see that even into next week and the week after. Because God is not random, and the events that unfold here are not random. But here's what we find. There's actually a tremendous lesson for us, a tremendous takeaway. We've been talking all year about this idea of justice. And the working definition that we have, and I keep coming back to it because it just keeps striking me, is that justice is the rigorous pursuit of moral principles resulting in rightness. That's our working definition of justice, the rigorous pursuit of moral principles resulting in rightness. Now, what happens is that when we are just people will be rewarded for their rightness. And we don't always see that. We don't always appreciate that. You go to work, you do what's right. You go out of your way to do what's right. You don't take shortcuts that other people are doing. You see people doing whatever they want, and you because you have a moral compass, because you have moral principles, you pursue those things, and you continue to do what's right and to try at all times to do what's right. And it feels like you get overlooked. Or is it just me? You been there? That it feels like, we're getting the short end of this all of the time, and no matter how much effort I put into being right, nobody's going to appreciate it. It doesn't have to just be at work. It could be at home. It could be out at play. It could be 1,000 places that you call and do life, where your sense of rightness, where your sense of moral principle, and your rigorous pursuit of those principles is not appreciated. In fact, we live in a day and age where many of the moral principles that we hold to that come out of the Bible that are God-breathed and God-given, we live in a day where some people call those wrong. And some people will call us wrong for pursuing them. And far from appreciating it, they will persecute us because they don't like us. And they don't like the reminder that we constantly throw into their face. Not intentionally, just by our action. But what we see here, and Mordecai experienced the exact same thing, is that just people will be rewarded for their rightness. It will come eventually. It may take days, it may take weeks, it may take months, it may take years, it may take you all the way into the next life. We sing about heaven being our home and heaven being our hope, heaven being our reward. And it may be that in this life you won't receive the reward, but it doesn't mean it's not coming. And so the next time that you're feeling, kind of laid out because you're working hard to be right and you don't seem to be getting anywhere from it. Understand and know that even if nobody else on earth is watching, God is watching. And even if nobody else on earth is interested in rewarding you, God is interested in rewarding you. And even if nobody else on earth actually goes ahead and does anything about it, God will one day do something about it. Now that's living with the end in mind, I grant you. But what I've found and what I've seen is that even in this life, God will reward us. It may not be with, a McMansion. It may not be with an expensive car or an expensive bank account or an expensive but there is something that God will do to reward you for your rightness. You say, what is it? I don't know. It's not my call. It's his. I tend to be more the Haman guy. Here, I'll help you enjoy your reward. Not that I'm fighting against it. But I can't tell you what it is. I can just tell you that it is. Just people are rewarded. Spin that on its head, completely the other side, the kind of Haman side of this equation. Injustice or injustice is the rigorous pursuit of immoral passion. Now, let me clarify, because I chained those two words together and our minds collectively run into the gutter, that immoral passion doesn't have to do with anything necessarily sensual or physical. It is just something that is not moral, which is all immoral means, and passion, which is just something that strikes our fancy as opposed to a principle that we're living by. And so an immoral passion could just be any vice, could be any pursuit, could be anything that interests us but is not right. Unjust people are driven by the rigorous pursuit of immoral passions. Just things that they want to do, that they're passionate about, that it seems like a good idea in the moment, that's not right, wrong, they don't even care. It's the thing. And so they chase it. That's all Mordecai was doing. His immoral passion was, you could call it avarice, you could call it greed, self-interest, narcissism. There's a few things we could assign to that. All tied together, but that was him. The rigorous pursuit of an immoral passion, his own self-advancement to the destruction of everybody, resulting in wrongness. Ultimately, Haman, was chasing this passion of his own self-interest, and it led him to some very dark, very evil, very wrong places. Because he was rigorously pursuing an immoral passion. It led him to wrongness. Now here's the truth, that unjust people will be repaid for their injustice. They will be repaid for their wrongness. Just as we saw Haman, who seemed like situated to be, if there was one guy we could say would get away with it, it would have been Haman. But it wasn't Haman. Because ultimately, who's the judge of the universe? God is. And does God believe in justice? Oh, yeah. He embodies justice, demands justice. And so unjust people will be repaid for their wrongness. And that's what we see in these two chapters. Mordecai rewarded for his rightness. Haman repaid for his wrongness. Now, here's the question. Which side of that equation are you on? Which side of that equation do you find yourself going? There's two things that we should really be able to answer at all times. And the first question is this: what do you pursue? Do you pursue moral principles, or do you pursue immoral passions? Do you live by what you know and define as being right, or do you just live floating with going with the flow, chasing whatever strikes your fancy, hoping it's right, but not really caring? Do you live by moral principles or immoral passions? I got to be honest and say, as I look around our world as a whole, as I look around our culture, is it a question as to which most people do? I mean, the people you life, the people in your life, the people you work with, the people you play with, how many of them are just drifting through life, chasing whatever strikes their fancy at any given point in time? We live in a country, we live in a civilization of people who are rigorously pursuing immoral passions. The second question that we need to be able to answer at all times, not just how do we live our lives, but what do you want to receive? And this may be the more telling. What do you want to receive in your life? Do you want to receive reward for things done well? Or do you want to receive repayment for things done poorly? Maybe starting with the end in mind is a better place to start. I don't know about you, but I don't want to live the life that Haman had. Maybe the middle part is fine, but I certainly don't want my bad day to be a cataclysmic last day the way his was. I don't want repayment for an unjust life. I like what Mordecai got. This is pretty cool. The king's favor and being paraded around and being, kind of ascendant in the king's perspective. I kind of like that, being rewarded for doing what's right. Which do you want to have happen to you? And once you decide which you want to have happen to you, then you know how you ought to live your life. Because if you want a reward for doing what's right, then guess what you're going to have to do? Help me out here. You're going to have to do what's right. That's the only way to get the reward for doing what's right. If you want to be repaid for doing what's wrong, then go ahead and do what's wrong. But the question for us that I see coming out of these two chapters is, which side of that equation do we want to be on? Which side of that equation do we want to live on and or die on? So can you answer those two questions? Do you live according to moral principles, or do you live according to immoral passions? Do you want to be rewarded, or do you want to be repaid? Do you want to be Haman, or do you want to be Mordecai? Myself, I vote for Mordecai. That's who I want to be. I want to do what's right. I want to chase what's right, and I want to be rewarded for doing what's right. I can't answer for you. Hopefully I've couched it in terms that makes a really easy decision, though. I don't think anybody in this room wants to be Haman. We certainly don't want to end up with heartburn that's 75 feet tall. It's up to you. Your choice. Father, we love you. We thank you for today. Lord, I thank you for the story. I'm thankful just for some resolution in this and finally seeing Haman getting what he had coming to him. And so, Father, we're thankful for that. We're thankful for Mordecai and receiving a reward that he did deserve. Lord, I think about my own life. I think about our lives here. Lord, I don't think it's a stretch of my imagination to say that we want to have the reward that Mordecai had. That we want to live our lives according to moral principles. I think one of the reasons we're here and we gather here week after week is because we want to know what your word says are moral principles so that we can live according to those moral principles. And so, Father, this morning, would you just encourage us to do that? Because the pursuit of moral principles is something that we have to decide afresh and anew every day, sometimes every moment as new opportunities arise. The enemy likes to throw opportunities in our way to live according to our passions. We certainly have them. And we could pursue them just like anybody else does. And so would you encourage us in the events of these stories to pursue those moral principles that we really want to be pursuing to the end that we might experience reward at your hand. Well, thank you for that in Jesus' good name.